we're talking with Cheryl Arvidsson. She is a senior communications analyst for the Government Accountability Office. She also worked on the economic stimulus program. She was the assistant communications director for the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board. You all remember that. It was just a few short years ago, back in 2009. Most interesting for all of us, she is a former media relations director and program director for the Freedom Forum and Museum. And while she was there, she was actually in charge of the Paul Miller Reporting Fellowship, Washington Reporting Fellowship, before it was transferred here to the National Press Foundation. So Cheryl is an old friend of the Paul Miller program. And maybe she'll even let you ask a couple of questions about how the program ran back then. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you ask about the food, she'll have a good answer. Before that, she has a strong journalism background. She was with UPI. She was a Washington correspondent for the Dallas Times-Herald and also for Cox Newspapers. So now she's with GAO and also works as a freelance writer for a variety of publications. So she's going to talk to us today about GAO, what they do, and how you can best interact with them to get better stories. So Cheryl, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm getting nods from the back of the room. So if you keep speaking at that level, we will be able to hear you, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry that I am not able to see you or be there in person. I'm somewhat of an isophobe. A few years back on a freelance assignment at, of all places, Churchill Downs, I walked out of the press room and hit the balcony with the plan to take a picture of the empty stands and then the full stands for this magazine article I was writing on the Breeders' Cup. I hit a patch of black ice and shattered my right leg and was laid up for 3 months without any ability to put any weight on it, and it took me about 6 months to fight my way back, and then I broke my leg again. So I'm not really big on ice, so that is why I am being a wimp today and being here and not able to see you in person. I'm delighted to be with you and tell you a little bit about GAO. I have to tell you, I've only been here at GAO for 2.5 years, which means that I'm not a veteran and there are a lot of things I don't know, but I do know a few things. One is that, in case you don't know GAO, we are the Government Accountability Office. Now, in the 1990s, they changed our name to this. We used to be the General Accounting Office. So anybody who's been around Washington for a while may still think that GAO stands for General Accounting Office. But fortunately, they figured out a way to change the name, capture the mission, and keep the same acronym, which helps immeasurably. Our offices are located in just real close to Chinatown, actually, at 441 G Street Northwest. We're between G and H, built up the whole block between 4th and 5th Street. So that is where we are. So if you ever need to find the office, that's where it's located. GAO is actually in the legislative branch. We are the investigative arm of Congress. And what that means is that it is our pleasure and responsibility, if you will, to take requests from members of Congress or committees of Congress, either the House or the Senate, people who have specific issues or questions about federal agencies and want to see how a certain program is running, how a certain agency is operating in certain areas. Those are called congressional requests. We also occasionally are listed in legislation that passes or in committee reports that accompany legislation and given a specific responsibility to conduct a performance audit. Those are called mandates, and we have a lot of those that come in through the legislative process where GAO is mandated to take a look at something, or maybe a new program or some sort of thing like that. And the third possibility of launching an investigation is called CG Authority, Comptroller General Authority. The Comptroller General of the United States, his name is Gene Dodaro, right now is actually an appointee. He serves a 15-year term, which is the longest term of any appointee in government. And the reason that there is such a long term for each Comptroller General is because of the desire to keep GAO independent and away from any kind of political pressures. GAO itself, when it was the old General Accounting Office, actually came into being in the early 1920s. There was a law called the Budget and Accountability Act of 1921 that required the president to issue an annual budget, which I'm sure you're all aware will be coming up shortly. And that same law created the GAO. In the early years, the government accounting office at the time did mainly voucher auditing, going over bills and lots of paperwork and purchases of payments and purchases from agencies. But starting after World War II, the agency sort of morphed into more of what it's been doing of late, which is financial audits, taking a look at the economy and efficiency of how government operates. And then more or less by the 60s, we moved into what is pretty much the stock and trade of GAO now, which are called performance audits. And that means that we take a look at different government programs to see how they're meeting their objectives, whether or not they're operating as planned. I'm sorry, did you have a question?
No, I think that sound meant that email came into the person's phone we're using. But go ahead, keep going.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
That's fine, Cheryl. I think the buzz was just that the phone we're using got a text.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, anyway, so moving right along here, we issue probably 1,000 reports or so a year, and of those reports, roughly 70% are from congressional requesters, and 20% are mandates. The 10% remaining would be the CG authority reports, and that could be. That is possible that you would do a CG authority report if there was a key issue, for example, that the Comptroller General felt was important enough to warrant the kind of look that GAO would give it, and he, on his own authority, could create the GAO work and try to get that process going. Normally, though, most of the things that we work on are by congressional request, and most of the things that I've worked on are by congressional request. The whole point of what we do is to try to provide information and support Congress in the deliberative process, get them material that will help them do their job best. As you probably can imagine, in this political atmosphere with as much controversy and division as there is on the Hill, even though GAO is an independent body, it's extremely important that we retain and maintain the support of our clients on Capitol Hill. And to do that, the agency is compelled to be fair and balanced and absolutely certain of what kind of material we are reporting on and reporting about. And as a result, there's a very, very, very strict process and procedure of how work is done. Let me just assure you, the words spontaneity and creativity are not words that are often used at GAO. Everything is pretty formulated and pretty strict because of the fact that you just have to be sure that the process is fair, that people on both sides of the issue will be able to look at a GAO work product, and conclude that we went down the middle and did our job as reasonably and in as balanced a fashion as possible. Now, what GAO reports in the old days, they used to be blue-covered documents, and they were all printed. Now, these days, you can still still make a request to get a printed report, but almost everything is online. And I'll go over in a few minutes some of the things that are done, but first I want to tell you about a couple of things coming up that might be really good stories for you that you may not be aware of in terms of what GAO does and how they operate. Among the responsibilities of GAO is that every 2 years the agency issues a report that's called the High Risk Report, and what that does is review a whole host of programs and operations in government from agency to agency and determine some of the reports, some of the operations of government that are most susceptible to waste or fraud or abuse, mismanagement, or have real need of reform in order to bring them into line and make them less risky in terms of taxpayer spending and taxpayer dollars. The high risk report is due out in early February of this year. So that will be the first high risk report that we've looked at in 2 years. And for reporters who are interested in all the kinds of topics that we cover, that would be a great opportunity to go in and take a look at the various programs. For example, if there's a program that's singled out as a high-risk program, that would give you the foot in the door, if you will, to go ahead and get in touch with the agency and find out what's going on over there. What's their response to this? Why is this happening? You could certainly get in touch with GAO for a little more background than is in the report on the programs that are listed. Some of them have been on the high risk list for quite some time. So I think that's a very good possibility of a good story. The other thing that we'll be doing coming up in the spring, in April, there's an annual report that GAO lists on reviews on duplication or overlap or fragmentation among various government programs, again, with the eye on how to avoid wasting taxpayer money. The duplication report comes out in April, probably just around the time of tax day. So that would be another possibility to be aware of that might give you some possibilities of writing some stories that relate to areas that you're interested in. Before I get into how these requests actually move through the system, does anybody have any questions about what I've covered so far?
Yeah, Cheryl, this is Mark Albert. I am a freelancer at CBS News. Can I just ask you on the first report that you talked about, the high risk report, you mentioned that some of these programs or operations have been on for multiple years. Do you rank them by the programs that have been on the longest?
No, you don't rank them, no, because there's no reason that just because something's been on a report, on a high-risk list for several years, doesn't mean that it's the worst possible risk out there. No, but usually in these reports, it will say that this has been on the list since such and such, or you certainly have the ability to get previous high-risk reports, and you can compare them.
It might not show that they're the worst, but it could show that they're tone deaf to fixing the problem.
I certainly wouldn't say that because we love all the agencies, but yeah. I think you as reporters have the ability to make interpretations of things on your own, and I would certainly encourage you to do so.
Thank you, Cheryl. Anybody else have a question before we move on? Go ahead, Tal.
In terms of, this is Tal Copen from Politico. In terms of figuring out when a report might come out, is there any way to know in advance, as opposed to waiting for just a GAO email that has the daily reports? Besides, sometimes I know congressional offices will tip reporters off.
Yeah, that's right. And I was going to get into that later, but we might as well talk about that now. Again, because of the constraints of dealing with Congress, GAO is not a leaking agency. it's not going to happen. I mean, believe me, I know leaks, and I can tell you that it's not going to happen. But what can happen is that if you have an office or a committee or somebody that you work with on the Hill, and you can determine, for example, that this individual, this committee, or a requester has actually asked GAO to make a report. If you can get that information, you have the ability to come to the PR operation at GAO, and if you ask about a specific report underway, that office can confirm for you that such a report is indeed underway, what kind of objectives it is looking at, and when it's likely to be released. Also, the requester gets a draft of this report 30 days before its public release. If the requester asks for a 30-day hold, GAO honors that request. If the requester doesn't care, the report is published like right away. But let's presume that there's a 30-day hold put on it, which is what usually happens. Then you have the perfect ability to get a leak from Capitol Hill. I would say you could also, the agency also gets a draft report of what's being done, and you could conceivably get a leak from them, although a lot of times the agency is being singled out for activities that it doesn't particularly relish publicity on. So I would say the probability of a Capitol Hill exclusive is a lot better than an agency exclusive. Now, you mentioned the possibility of getting on an email list and that sort of thing. So I had a list that I was going to bring with me to show you all, but I don't, obviously I'm not there. But here is a web page that you should write down. Hold on a sec. I, of course, can't find the web page that I'm looking for. Bear with me a second. Shuffle through papers. Yeah, http:// www.gao.gov/feeds feeds.html. That is a page that tells you all about what connection options are available with GAO in terms of how to find out about information. You mentioned the email updates. You have the ability to, I'm just going to read this list just to give you a sense of how many possibilities there are that you can get alerts to. You could sign up for a topic update on everything from agriculture and food, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was the stimulus program that was mentioned earlier, auditing and financial management, budget and spending, business regulation, consumer protection, economic development, education, employment, energy, equal opportunity, financial markets, government operations, healthcare, homeland security, housing, human capital, information management, information security, justice, law enforcement, international affairs, defense, natural resources and environment, retirement security, science and technology, space, tax policy, telecommunications, transportation, veterans, worker and family assistance. Now those are just, you can imagine, I mean, those are huge topics like natural resources and environment, for example, which is the agency that I work for, the team that I work for at GAO. We put out about 300 reports a year, and we cover everything from nuclear security, nuclear facilities, and nuclear waste to crop insurance, to FDA, to EPA, to the Army Corps of Engineers. I mean, a huge number of things fall within environment and natural resources. And, those reports are what we work on. Interestingly enough, I can tell you, as a reporter, I covered about 1 million things, and I never covered anything to do with environment and natural resources. So this has been quite a learning experience for me. And I must admit that I'm prejudiced, of course, because it's what I do. But I think it's incredibly interesting. The stuff that it really touches people. Huge amounts of material that really touch people. And I think that that's something you might want to really think about going into. The other thing that you might want to do in terms of developing possibility of stories would be if there are some areas that you work in that have involvement with government agencies. It might, you might talk to maybe an interest group or a stakeholder or someone who's involved with this area that you're interested in and ask them if there are any problems that they're aware of with the way that the agency is operating or the program is running. And if you can get a hook that way, going in kind of the back door, you would then be able to go to one of your members of Congress or either the House or the Senate or one of the responsible committees and ask them if there's been any requests for GAO work in this topic. You might discover that, in fact, there is a pending request going on that way, so it's certainly a possibility. Anyway, let me give you, unless you have some questions right now, I was going to give you a sense of just how involved the process of developing these reports is.
Any questions from the room? No. All right, Cheryl, looks like clear sailing. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, all right. Let's say you're Congressman X or Senator Y, and you're the chairman or ranking member of a committee, which is what usually is the source of our requests. They usually come from the committee themselves, or from the ranking member, or the chairperson, although they can be just an individual member with an interest. Let's say that GAO gets a letter, the Comptroller General gets a letter asking for a specific request. So that goes right to the top management levels. That at top management will then review the whole idea that's being proposed in the letter and decide, first of all, whether or not to proceed. I mean, among the things you'd look at, is this a solid request, for example? Is it a duplication of recent or previous work? Is there really any there, if you will? And if indeed they decide there is there, then it moves on. And it's very possible that once you get a letter of this sort and the decision is made to go forward with this request, that it may be such a large or complicated request that it ends up having to be broken into many parts and can't all be handled in a single audit. I've had a couple of instances recently in the last year or so where there were one request generated 5 different jobs because it was so involved. There were so many things that were being looked at. And so considering the fact that each of these jobs can take as much as a year or more to complete, you can imagine how much work can be involved in some of these requests. So once this request is, let's presume it's not one that's going to take several parts, and once it's approved, it then will go on to the next level, which is also the management level, where it needs to have an evaluation made of whose responsibility it falls into. For example, at GAO, there are some in our division. There are some people who are much more involved with defense issues and nuclear. There's somebody else who's been food safety has been a good specialty. Somebody else does a lot of agriculture jobs, Army Corps. And so there are various management types who have responsibility over more of the general topics. So those individuals get these jobs, and then you assign an assistant director as well as staff members to each of these jobs. And you can have a team, the working team of 2 or 3 different GAO auditors who who will be working on developing the actual text and copy of this report and doing all the research, as well as a lawyer will be assigned who will help you with taking a look at the legal implications, what kind of laws are actually there, what are the actual true legal requirements that are imposed on agencies in order to do the work that they're doing. You also will have people who are accountants and specialists in statistical analysis. They'll be assigned because quite often there's a data analysis division of this that requires, sometimes we can use the agency's own data, sometimes we have to run our own kind of sorts and our own kind of reviews and information of what data they have. Sometimes we have to create our own databases. And when you get a GAO report, there's always a section called Scope and Methodology, and that always will review exactly the kind of techniques and statistical analysis and various reports that were developed to try to get the findings that we're reporting on. So those people are all assigned to the job. In addition, the job has a group called stakeholders, and stakeholders can involve people who have other peripheral involvement in an issue. For example, you could bring in, like if you have a report on global warming or a study on global warming, there might be several other teams within natural resources and environment that have been involved in elements of this. So some representatives of those teams will show up at a meeting to discuss some of the stuff that they found and some of the problems they may have encountered or some of the areas that they want to give you a heads up on that need to be looked at. You will have people like the chief economist, for example, may have input. You have a person who's called the chief scientist who may have some specific information as well. All of these people, as well as any other team where there might be implications or might be some overlap, will be considered stakeholders, and they'll be involved in the discussions that lead to the production of the report. Before you get too far along, the key auditors who are involved in doing the reviews will do an awful lot of preliminary work to try to develop some of the general areas that they think might be fruitful to look at and some of the general issues that might need to be addressed, as well as some overview background on the topic. Then all the people I just mentioned, as well as the various analysts and we as communications analysts, because we're involved in drafting these documents, we'll all get together in a basically a giant brainstorming session and talk about this project and see where there might be some problems with what's being laid out by the team initially, where there might be some areas that need to be looked at further to be involved, and all of those thoughts then are collected and put into something that's called the design matrix, which sketches out the plans for the job, what kind of objectives there'll be, and objectives meaning what are the questions we're going to be asking to be answered in order to meet this request, and what kind of criteria, for example, will be used to assess the performance of these various areas or to look at whether something is working or not working. We'll also do in this design matrix a general discussion of the scope and methodology and what kind of limitations we're likely to encounter, if any. Once that's developed and all the various stakeholders sign off and approve it, we usually go and then meet with the Hill staff that have requested this report, advise them of what we're talking about doing, how we're looking at going to be approaching their job, what kind of time frames we're looking at, and also the kind of general, just general issues that will be covered. And once they sign on to that, that gives us the green light to go forward. After a considerable more amount of time researching, interviewing, doing whatever has to be done, you get to a point of developing a message agreement that essentially fleshes out the points that were made in your design document, gets you into a lot more of the background, a lot more of the reasons for doing what we're doing, a lot more of just the general discussion of the topics, and possibly some of the preliminary findings and possible recommendations that you might be working on. That also has to get approval from all of the various partners and stakeholders, at which point you start fleshing out the message agreement, which into the full report. Once the full report is done, again, a long, involved process, every point in that report that makes a conclusion or a finding or cites a fact of any sort has to be referenced and documented so that every point that's being made is checked and double-checked, because you cannot assert any kind of interpretation of the law, for example, unless you have a citation of the law that backs that up. You have to prove it all. And again, that is part of the whole reason of being balanced and fair and absolutely on point on these reports. And eventually, you get everything referenced and documented. You then send a draft of this, or you develop some facts that you take with an exit conference with the agency, and you sketch out with the agency what you found. They give you feedback if there's an area where you may have misinterpreted something, or they want something further elaborated on, or they think you need to add certain things or whatever, or they agree with you but have some problems. All of that can come up in an exit conference. Eventually you get to the draft report and you get it to the Hill, and you have this 30-day, usually, hold on it, and then it's published. And that is the process. But as you can imagine, that is a long, long process. And but again, if you have to be responsible to a divided Congress and you're worrying about your credibility, there's really no choice but to be extra, extra careful. And I think that GAO's reputation has been excellent. Now, that can also mean when you see the report as a reporter that you will find this to be incredibly dull or boring. I have to tell you that my instincts as a journalist ran quite contrary to what was required in terms of writing style at GAO. And it took me a long time to essentially figure out that I still had ways to exercise some creativity, but that my old journalistic writing style had to go sit down somewhere else for a while. For example, if you call something at the beginning of the report a large brown dog, you will have to use that term forever. Now, if you're a reporter, you might call it, a slobbering hound or the vicious carnivore or something of that sort, just to try to pique the reader's interest and keep them engaged. Believe me, at GAO, it is a dog, a large brown dog, a dog throughout. You will never see it called anything but that. So be prepared for that. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to go into that report, just like you would a press release from anybody you get a press release for. Very rarely do you run those press releases without rewriting them. Very rarely would you want to run a GAO report without going in and making some of your own interpretations, I suspect. But that's your job, not our job.
Cheryl,
So
can I stop you for a second?
Yeah.
You just gave us a really good explanation of all of the people who have a piece of preparing the report or doing the investigation. Once the report is published, is it possible for journalists to get access to those people, somebody besides the communications staff, if they want specifics like the lawyers or other people who were part of the investigation?
Based on GAO policy, you would be talking to the managing director of the team that developed the report. That individual, or possibly he might or she might send you to the director who was in charge of the project. That would be where you would have to go to try to get the information you were looking for. Those are the only people who would speak for GAO on a specific project.
Okay.
But you certainly have the ability to get hold of them and talk to them further about the report. And people do. I mean, a lot of times you'll see that various folks will be interviewed. I mean, you can even do it on like the high risk report. Like we added climate change a couple of years ago as one of the high risks that government was facing, and our managing director at NRE gave a bunch of media interviews to flesh out that, and that's always possible.
We have a couple of more questions in the room. Tal, go ahead.
Tal from Politico again. I was curious, as a former journalist who, we talk about sort of crossing the line, but is there anything that you wish you knew as a journalist about dealing with communications professionals who also have a journalism background? I mean, is there anything that we can do better in interacting with you to sort of understand how we can both sort of do our jobs?
Boy, we should be at a bar. My biggest problem with reporters since I left the field and went into essentially spokesperson and media relations jobs is just incredible laziness on the part of the reporters. So often, people who are not willing to get up from their computer and go out and do a little digging on their own, people who don't do enough research to really understand the topic or reach a decision and just rush off to a conclusion without really having enough material behind it. And I think, I also think that it's perfectly acceptable for a reporter to say to a person who's in a communications job, hey, I'm really new at this. I don't understand everything I should on this. Can you either give me some material to read or guide me through or talk me through this so I have a better basis? And I think that makes a huge difference. And I would absolutely urge you to know your field and get away from the computer and use some shoe leather and talk to people who real people, rather than just looking for things on the computer. One example that comes to mind that it still really bothers me, but when I was with the Recovery Board, one of the things that the Recovery Board did, the stimulus program that was out there, was that for the very first time ever, people who received federal money, grants and federal money, were required to report what they were doing with the money. What kind of projects they were running, how much they were spending, where the project was located, if they had subcontractors that they were hiring, how many jobs they were creating, all sorts of really important information that was being reported. And to do that, if you haven't already found this out in Washington, it's almost impossible for one government agency's database to talk to another agency. That the jealousness of that agencies hold their own data and their own operations with is just incredible, and cooperation is very limited. And so the Recovery Board had to figure out how were they going to collect data that involved 12 or 13 different agencies of government that didn't have systems that reported that could be read by one another or could be put into a universal system. So basically we had to create one from scratch, and did under incredible pressure. We got the first reports out online, and they were rich with information, but we screwed up in one area. We made the foolish assumption that people might either know their zip code or the congressional district in which they operated. And it turned out that people didn't. And in most instances they did, but in some cases people put in the wrong or a non-existent congressional district. We got hit with a story that came out saying that there was like vast sums, millions upon millions of missing money had gone out under the Recovery Act because the wrong congressional districts were listed on a few reports. And nobody who reported that story had come to us and asked at the Recovery Board, why is this the case? If they had asked that, we could have found the answer for them and shown that the money wasn't missing. It was just filed under a congressional district that didn't exist. There was still a story there, and the story was that the initial run-through of a new database wasn't right. But it wasn't a scandal involving hundreds of millions of dollars of missing money. And the hundreds of millions of dollars of missing money persisted as a story throughout the entire time that I was at the Recovery Board for 3 years. And that was a result of not just picking up the phone and asking a question. So that's a long answer, but that would certainly be a good way to start.
All right. I think Mark had a question, and then we have another one.
Okay.
Cheryl, Mark again here. When you talk about reporters doing their homework and whatnot, does the GAO ever hold background calls? Like if you know you're going to be putting out a report, whether it's an annual report or whatnot, do you ever send out a note a week in advance saying, hey, we're going to have a background or even on the record call about this and we'll walk you through it?
Not about specific reports that I'm aware of, Mark. They do podcasts, and that note that webpage that I referred you to has some information about GAO podcasts, and there are also blogs that talk about specific work. But in terms of background briefings, to my knowledge, I'm not aware of anything like that because of the problem, again, that you would get into with the release date and honoring the requester's request that no information go out until he or she releases it.
Okay. Elizabeth, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm Elizabeth Harbaugh. I'm from Environment and Energy Publishing. Earlier you mentioned that sometimes you get a request from a congressman that spurs multiple reports. Is there any way for us to figure out that genesis? Because sometimes it's very revealing who is asking what question, in addition to knowing how many reports are linked back to that question. How can we figure that out?
Well, in the report that comes out, right at the beginning of the report, it's addressed to a requester.
Yeah.
And it specifically says, you asked us to look at such and such.
I'm sorry. I'm more interested, can we figure out how if that report is linked to 3 other reports for the same question? Is there an easy way to figure that out?
Well, I mean, I guess you can't. Well, for example, if you see a report that's going out to the same person with 3 different types of topics, I guess I don't understand why you would think that would make any difference. Maybe we should start there.
I guess it's more of a story like there's a single question asked, and it would be nice to know that there were 3 different reports produced to answer that question, so we had this scope of the answer to that whole question. And
I think maybe you misunderstood a little bit about how you would divide up a topic.
Okay.
Here's an example for one of the reports that I did that's already been released and is out there was on the Missouri River flood and drought of 2012. Okay, and how the drought came first in 2011, and then the flood came in 2012, and there was a lot of concern, or maybe it was flood. I guess it was flood and drought. But anyway, there was a lot of concern at the time about the Army Corps of Engineers, and you asked the question was originally asked about just the fact that there'd been the floods, and there was worry about how I think that the Army Corps agreed to release some water from some of the reservoirs to try to keep the reservoirs from overflowing and that sort of thing, and it flooded some farmland, and so people were very upset about the fact that they had been extra flooded because of all the water that accumulated in the reservoirs. Well, so everybody was focused, and you started the report on the flood. Well, and amazingly, the following year, you had a total drought, so you had a complete reversal of this. Well, while GAO was working on the first report involving the flood, you ended up having a drought. And so they broadened the scope of the report to incorporate both of those things. And so that ended up to be basic got addressed based on one request. Sometimes, in some cases, you will have somebody say, well, let's say, what about crop insurance? And somebody will say, well, let's do a report on whether or not, how the crop insurance programs works. Well, that's such a broad topic that you might want to break that into something like, well, what would happen if you raised premiums? What would happen if you reduce subsidies? I mean, you could break it up into several different topics that would address the general point of crop insurance, but it wouldn't be 3 reports that would deal with the same thing.
Cheryl, this is Mark Greenblatt with the Scripps Washington Bureau. I'm sort of curious, listening to you talk. So 70% of what GAO does is sort of driven by congressional requests, and and you're an apolitical organization, and yet some members of Congress, I imagine, might want to abuse the right to sort of ask for a question and delve into sort of a political arena. Is it? Can you ever say no if they ask you to look into something?
Yeah, if something is not is just not a valid request, I am certain that you can say no. I mean, that's one of the things that happens at the high management levels, is way above my pay grade. But I'm sure you could. What would be more likely is that you might have a requester who clearly would have a political interest one way or the other in making a request, but in structuring the response to that request, you can make your response broader so that it's more balanced. That's basically, you just have to always be aware of the fact that you're dealing in a very charged political arena, and you have to have something that can come down and be viewed as reasonable and fair by both sides. If the requester conceivably is really distressed with what you end up with, that individual always could say, hey, I don't want to be the requester anymore, and pull his or her name off the report, although I'm not aware of anything like that ever happening.
And I had one follow-up. I was just sort of curious just how it works, because I've read through a number of your reports. I think they're awesome. But if you think about like just sort of controversies and how they play out over the Hill, you always hear these stories about how one agency won't release emails, or somebody else won't release data that even Congress is really pushing to see, and you see people screaming about it. And yet somehow you guys seem to get access to really good information that leads to really interesting stuff. I mean, I'm just sort of curious, like, is there, like what's up with that? How do you do it?
Well, I think the power of the purse comes into play to a great extent. I mean, first of all, you work really, really hard to do a good job. And if, for example, you want some information from an agency and you're being completely told either that it doesn't exist, or being stonewalled, or being denied access to certain things, there are a whole lot of ways that you can for example, you could let the requester know that this agency isn't cooperating. And that agency might find out that it didn't get as much appropriation as it wanted to, or someone might put some very bad publicity out in a press release. I mean, you keep in mind that all these agencies, although they're certainly independent and they certainly want to seem to be spending the taxpayers' money as best they can, they are all subject to being appropriated by Congress. And so if you tick off your appropriators, guess what? You're likely to get a whole lot less money, and I think that that's the game in Washington. Nobody wants less money, especially in these days, considering the fact that there's very little money out there.
I have a question. Hi, Cheryl. This is Clarissa Jimenez with Associated Press Television News. I have two questions. The first one has to do with the legal decisions that GAO makes. I was curious to know, how do you decide what cases to take on and the process for making these legal decisions, and how can we as journalists keep track of these decisions, like email alerts? Is there a way that we know in advance that they're coming? And also, could you talk about congressional testimony and how is it decided that GAO is going to testify before Congress? And also, how can we find out about these hearings in advance and know that you're going to be testifying?
Well, let me go with the testimony first. Often GAO is brought to the Hill to testify as expert witness in certain types of reports and in certain types of topics. It is not uncommon, for example, for a requester who has gotten a GAO report on something to decide to make that report public in a hearing where GAO is essentially the witness presenting the findings. And that would be tantamount to releasing the report either at the 30-day time where the hold is on it or before. If the requester wants to release it quicker, they have a perfect right to do that. In terms of knowing whether or not GAO will be the witness on something, again, you just are going to have to make your contacts with the committees that are interested in the areas you're interested in and see if they have any GAO work pending. I mean, they will, I would think in most cases, are interested in getting the stories out that they've asked for GAO to investigate X, Y, or Z. So I would think they might be willing to share with you the fact that a request on a certain topic has been made. Equally so, if you are express an interest in that and ask if they have any hearings scheduled, they would probably be able to tell you that and ask if GAO will be a witness. But it isn't going to come from the GAO side, I guess is what I'm saying. It's going to have to come from the Congress side. In terms of the legal decisions, you have hit an area that I have to confess I do not know anything about. There is on the webpage that I gave you, there is a link that has to do with legal issues. I know that GAO handles and has a division that is responsible for handling things called bid protests, which I wish as a reporter I had dug into a little more because I think that would be fascinating. My understanding is that is where somebody puts out, one agency puts out some sort of a RFP, a request for a proposal. They pick a winner of a bid, and one of the losers protests the decision to pick that winner for whatever reasons may be in place. And I think it's GAO that makes the decision on some of those things. I have to, however, tell you that I do not know the answer, and I would suggest you go to our PR people and ask them those questions because that's just an area I've had nothing to do with.
Okay, thank you.
Let me also give you the name of the public affairs person so that you have that. Chuck Young is his name, and you can reach him at, somewhere I have it here. I'll get you a phone number as I root through my notes. I don't have him right now, but I'll get it for you before long. Are there any other questions?
Oh, yes, we've got one.
Do you ever end up holding, or do you ever end up not releasing a report?
I'm not familiar with us not releasing any report. I heard stories, and I don't know the specifics about this. I heard stories that at one report that the requester did not like at all the way the report came out and withdrew his name, but that the agency felt that the report was absolutely right on and needed to be released, and that it ultimately was made as a report to the agency that was involved and released under Comptroller General authority. But that's kind of apocryphal. I don't know the specifics. I don't know when that happened. It's a while back. But, you know, if you put, there one other thing about that. I mean, there are some times when, even though you go through as many vetting procedures and as much review as possible, you may end up with a topic that either is just simply unwieldy, or when you get into it, it's just not going to happen. I mean, whatever it is that you think you're supposed to be trying to find isn't going to be there, or you can't really legitimately keep going with the report. And it is possible to stop the process before you spend who knows how many hundreds and hundreds of hours of staff time and a year's worth of work to get there. But those would be stopped in the early stages. They wouldn't be anything that would be like to the very end. You've got a report and you say, oh, let's not issue it. That just wouldn't happen. Here is Chuck Young's. This is Chuck Young's phone number. It's 202-512-3823. And his email is youngc1c1
Can you repeat the phone number, please?
512-3823, area code 202.
Thank you.
And he will be, he's the person who can confirm to you if there is, and if you do get information from a committee or a congressman or a congresswoman that a certain topic is being reviewed by GAO, he'll be able to confirm that there is such a review underway and give you information on what's being looked at.
And do you have any, like, I may not want a specific report that's coming out, but let's say I'm looking into a particular topic area or agency. If I contacted your office, do you guys have experts that can sort of give us background information and walk us through any reports you all might have done in the past on specific topic areas, or do you only talk about reports themselves?
As I said, GAO is not going to give you much in the way of interviews on anything except an existing report. But you have the perfect ability. If you go to gao.gov, the public website, you can search on a topic, whatever topic it is, and you'll get a whole litany of previous reports. It'll give you all the links to previous reports that have been done on these things. And when they came out, and you have a perfect ability to pull them right up and read either the highlights page, which is a summary, the whole thing. You have those are all available, and there's a lot of stuff there, and you can see the areas that have been looked at in the past and what some of the findings have been. Also, in the GAO reports that come out, the current reports, quite often. Those reports cite previous work of GAO, and that gives you the ability to look them up. And often, also, those reports or previous reports will make certain recommendations that an agency do certain things, and those recommendations are tracked on the website as to what has been, whether agencies have followed through and done them. And if they're not visible on the website, like if you have a current report, for example, it might say, in 2010, GAO recommended that X, Y, or Z, that this agency do this, this, and this. As of April of 2014, only one of those recommendations had been implemented. So you'll find that quite often in the existing reports. And you also have the ability to pick up the phone and call an agency and say, hey, I see here in 2012, GAO recommended that you do such and such, such and such and such and such. What is the status of action on those recommendations?
Other questions? Amber?
This is Amber Phillips with the Las Vegas Sun. Are there any GAO alumni you recommend we reach out to who could talk to us on background explaining a report?
Cheryl, could you hear that?
People who aren't with the agency, you mean?
Yes.
Any longer? I've only been there for 2.5 years, so I can't tell you, but my guess would be that it would be, you could certainly look for names, but I think that's a long shot. I just think the report is going to be what the report is, and you'll have to, if you're looking for further background, I would think that going to groups that work in the area, that sort of thing, that's the best place to do your reporting. Not GAO. You're not going to get more dirt than is in the report.
Okay, other questions? All right, Cheryl, do you have anything else for us?
Well, no, I was going to, I guess you asked about the previous Paul Miller program, and I was going to tell you a little bit about how it used to work at the Freedom Forum. I'll just give you a real brief overview. Back in those days, it was all regional reporters, first of all, and that was when there used to be regional reporters.
We have a couple. We have a couple in the room.
There are very few still that exist, but back in those days, there were people who were coming in to cover for specific areas and specific topics, and so we focused our various it was kind of a how does Washington work, and how do you find and develop stories that are available for your readership's interest areas. So it was really, really tightly focused. We did an awful lot of work on agencies and specific agencies, and we took field trips to places where, you might not normally even think to go. I remember one that we took that was a great reporting trip was to the CIA, and we got a great briefing on CIA operations. We got to tour the CIA's spy museum, which was really cool. And, that was really fun. But probably the highlight, as has been alluded to, was the food of the program. But back when the Freedom Forum had money, they also had a chef, and the food was just magnificent, and people used to call it the Feed 'em Forum. So I think everybody who went through the Paul Miller program gained a few pounds.
And Cheryl, was that also, were you there at the time when the monthly meetings were 2 days?
Yes, I ran 3 years worth of 2 days of meetings, yep.
Yeah. How many, I'm just going to ask for a show of hands in the room, how many of you think you could actually get away for 2 days a month rather than one? We've got about 3 or 4 hands up, maybe, in our group of 20.
Oh, yeah, I believe that was true. That was one of the things that we had to do in terms of, I had to run the whole thing. I ran the whole thing. I set up the topics and oversee the programs and pick the people and with advice from a board, but it was essentially on me. And one of the things I had to look at really, really carefully in selecting the fellows was those individuals who had so much work that it was really unrealistic that they would be able to spend 2 days a month at the Freedom Forum. I remember one woman in particular was really upset that I didn't pick her, but she was writing for 8 different newspapers in 4 different states. And I said, I'm sorry, and you probably need this program more than anybody else. But if you're writing for 8 papers in 4 states, the chance of you not having stories that you have to cover 2 days a month are pretty slim. And I think it was the right decision.
Interesting. How big were your classes?
About the same size. Did you have 24 now? Is that what you said?
Yes.
We were around 20, I think.
Yeah. So it's about the same.
Mm-hmm.
Well, very interesting. Anybody else have any questions about anything? About the agency, about former Paul Miller? Breaking your leg? No. Okay. Well, Cheryl, thank you so much. I really appreciate your doing this and going through all of these technical hoops this morning. And but this has just been great, and I think there's a lot of good information.
Well, I wish you all luck. You've got a tough job, and thank you very much again. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I hope that this is helpful.
All right. Well, next year.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Uh-huh.
Bye.
Bye-bye.